Hey guys, welcome back. Now, as we're in autumn, I thought it would only make sense to make a pumpkin cake. Now, it's not just a pumpkin flavored cake, it's actually going to be in the shape of a pumpkin too. So this is my first tutorial on a shaped buttercream cake. So usually when you get a shaped cake, it has a layer of fondant over it because it's usually a novelty cake, but I'm going to show you the best way how to decorate it just in buttercream, yet keep the bespoke shape, and in this case, it's going to be a pumpkin. So to start off, I'm going to make my basic sponge, but I'm going to slightly adjust it with the addition of some pumpkin. So this is pumpkin puree. You can find it in tins, but you can make it yourself, which is exactly what I did here because I couldn't find any. What you do is peel and steam about 350 grams of pumpkin or squash. Make sure it's really soft and then use a hand blender or one of those smoothie makers and blend it to a puree. It's as simple as that. You obviously just need to wait until it's cold before you use it. So in my bowl here, I have some oil. Now I'm going to use oil for this recipe. As some of you are aware, my normal sponge cake works with both oil and butter. So I'm showing you how it turns out with oil today. And into the oil, I'm going with some light brown sugar. I think the brown sugar adds this more caramelly flavor and therefore goes with the pumpkin flavor more. And I'm also going to put some vanilla powder in too. And then using a whisk, mix that together. Now, if you're used to my recipe, you're used to the butter and sugar forming more of a paste. The oil doesn't tend to do that, but it's really easy to mix in. And again, it works just the same way. And I've got my eggs here and they're gonna go straight into the mix and mix them through. And it's the eggs that really binds the oil and sugar together in this case. So they've mixed in nicely. And now I'm going to add my flour and flavour. So what I've also done for you today is write the quantities of plain flour with the addition of baking powder rather than just self-raising, because a lot of you get in touch and say that you don't have access to self-raising. So if you head to the comments below, you'll see the quantities there. So this is the flour and baking powder together, and that's going to go straight in. And then what I have here is actually a pumpkin pie mix of spices, which sounds very fancy, but all it is a mixture of nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, and clove. So if you don't have a ready mix to hand, you can always just make your own mix with the blend of those specific spices. So I'm going to go in with 2 heaped teaspoons of spice. Smells so autumnal. And then I'm going to fold that through. Now I'm using the whisk just to get rid of any big flour lumps, but once they've gone, I'll change to a spatula. And use that to incorporate all the remaining ingredients and scrape down the bowl. So you can see a really nice batter has already formed, but of course we want the addition of the pumpkin. So this is why I always go on about how great my recipe is, because it's so adaptable. You can probably see from the comments that it's my normal recipe, just adapted with the flavor and the oil and the addition of pumpkin, and it works a treat. So the pumpkin can go straight into the mix and then fold that through. So I actually find that the addition of pumpkin in this recipe firstly adds a little bit of moisture to the cake, which is always a good thing, and therefore no need to soak it once it's cooked. But also it lessens the sweetness a little bit, which can also be nice from time to time. And with the addition of those autumnal spices, this really is an amazing pumpkin cake recipe, and so easy to make. So the mix is fully incorporated. I'm just going to leave that to the side and prepare my baking tins. So for this cake, I'm using 2 half-sphere baking tins, and they actually come with a little ring to cook on, so they stand upright in the oven. If you don't have access to these, you can also just cook the cake in a small metal or glass bowl and line it properly. But these cakes are great if you're ever cooking a football-shaped cake or anything circular, or just using half is also a good idea for some shapes. Now, when it comes to doing shaped cakes, usually it's quite hard to line with paper, especially when it's circular. So I'll show you another way how to prepare a tin. I've got some butter here in some tissue, and I'm just going to rub the butter on the inside of the tin to create a nice layer of butter. I've also got some extra plain flour here, which I'm going to sprinkle into each tin, and then shake the flour around by tapping the tin slightly to get an even layer of flour on top of the butter. And this is what's going to make the cake not stick to the tin, which is super important. And just remove the excess. And now the tins are ready for the batter. Now obviously it's more difficult to weigh the batter in each tin, so I'm just going to go by eye and do it as evenly as possible. So it is important, if you are using these tins, to make sure the tins are as level as possible. So my oven's been preheated at 170 degrees Celsius, and the cakes are going to bake for about 45 to 50 minutes until they're completely cooked through. What you want to make sure is that these tins are very even, because you obviously want an even rise. What you'll notice is that the pumpkin has made the batter a little bit heavy, and the cakes may not rise as much as they would usually for a normal sponge. Once they're cooked and cooled for about 10 minutes in their tins, I'm going to wrap them in cling film and decorate it tomorrow. So my cakes came out perfectly. What I did is that I left them in the tin to cool and then outturned them and leave them to cool completely. And that is how you maintain the smooth round shape and not let any of the cake get stuck to the tin. Now I did keep them in cling film overnight, like I would do with a normal cake, to make sure it's less crummy for when we decorate it. And now I'm going to cut the cake. Now because it's a bowl or half sphere shape, it's going to be a bit difficult to cut it on the surface because it's going to obviously roll around. So I've got myself a small bowl here, which I'm going to put 1/2 in. And then I'm going to use my normal cutting technique and pretend that it's a normal cake, and the bowl is going to help the cake turn around. So as usual, start with a little insert and rotate the cake. And this also doesn't affect the roundness of the bottom of the cake too. And then gradually go through. This smells unbelievable. I can smell those spices so much. I may even have to just taste a bit because I can't wait till the final cake's done. So moist too, especially from that pumpkin. Delicious. Same with the other one. And now I can turn them this way up. And what I'm going to do is actually cut these in half. So if you want to maintain a real round shape, I would recommend just keeping it like this, and then you get a perfect ball. But because I'm making a pumpkin, I want it slightly taller, so I'm going to create 4 layers out of the cake. So we'll cut each of these halves in half again. And now I can do it without the bowl because it lies flat on the surface. So I've got 2 larger halves and 2 smaller halves. Now what I'm going to do with one of the rounder ones, I'm just going to cut off the very top because I want it to sit flat onto the cake board. Just a little bit. And this time I actually will keep these cake scraps because I'm going to use these to make the stem of the pumpkin at the end. And now it's time to build up the cake. So I'm actually using an acrylic disc, but you can use a cake board, both work. You just need a surface to put the cake on. And I have some buttercream already in a piping bag. So I am using my Swiss meringue buttercream. Usually I would say you can fill a cake with anything and decorate it, of course. But the technique that I'm going to show you when we make the orange for the outside of the pumpkin only works with a softer buttercream such as Swiss meringue. So I highly recommend it, and remember I do have a YouTube channel showing you how to make it. So as usual, I'm going to secure the cake onto the board with a little bit of buttercream and take that first rounded piece that I flattened the top of and place it onto the cake board. And now apply a thin layer of buttercream. So I'm going to spread that out so it's nice and even. So when you're doing shaped cakes, it's important to actually have a thin layer of buttercream between the cakes, otherwise the cake layers may slide around and lose the shape. Now I'm going to go on with the top piece of that, so it should match up, and another layer of buttercream. Flatten that out. Next layer of cake. Last layer. And finally the top of the cake, which is nice and round. And now, just like any cake, I'm going to crumb coat it with a thin layer of this buttercream. So I'll firstly fill in the gaps between the layers and then spread it around the cake using my step palette knife. So obviously I don't want this pumpkin as a perfect circle, but when you're doing shaped cakes, it's quite difficult to shape the cake and cut into it when it's room temperature with soft buttercream. So I'm going to finish the crumb coating, then put it in the freezer before I shape it into the pumpkin. So as you can see, it's hard to get a perfectly smooth crumb coat when you're just using the palette knife because of the rounded surfaces. So I'll show you a trick on how to shape it smoothly, which will also come in handy when we do the second coating with the orange colour. So I've got here a piece of acetate, which is a thin piece of plastic. If you don't have acetate exactly, you can also use a plastic sleeve, just something with a little bit of strength. And because this bends, you can use this as your scraper. So I'm going to go up and over the cake with the acetate slightly bent, and it will follow the shape of the round cake. And of course, it is the crumb coat, so it doesn't have to be completely perfect, but this really helps achieve that round shape. So it is hard to achieve a perfect circle, but luckily pumpkins are grown naturally, so it really doesn't matter if the circle shape isn't perfect either. And also, I'm going to cut into it anyway. So for me, this crumb coat is good enough. Now I'm going to put this cake into the freezer because I want it really cold before I carve it into a pumpkin shape. So my cake is very cold, which means I can now sculpt it. So trust me, it's a lot easier to do this at this stage rather than it being too soft. So it does make a little bit of a mess, but not to worry, because we're basically going to carve it into a pumpkin shape. So to start off, I'm going to create these grooves. So I've got a small serrated knife here, and I'm just going to go down each side of the cake and just mark where I'm going to cut. So I've kind of created this like open cut shape, and we'll do that on the opposite side too. And I'm going to make about 6 of them. So depending on how big your cake is, or how many grooves you want your pumpkin to have, you can do as many cuts as you like. So I've evenly spaced the grooves, and now I can start cutting in. So carefully start removing little bits of cake at a time. So I'm kind of cutting at a diagonal as I go in. Hopefully the cake will just come out. And I'll add that to the bowl of the leftover cake from before. So you can see this sort of opening that we're achieving. So I'm not sure if you follow me on Instagram or not, but you may have seen last year I made this epic Halloween cake. I was unable to record it for YouTube, but this was the top tier. So I did promise something. So I had to wait till this year to recreate the Halloween pumpkin cake. So you can see where the mess starts to happen, but what I'm going to do now is round these edges of each segment to kind of create these rounded grooves around the pumpkin. If at any point your cake gets too soft, you can always just put it back in the freezer before you do some more cutting. So I'm using a smaller knife here so I can cut to a more finer detail. And it doesn't have to be exact because you still have the buttercream to make the final shape of the pumpkin. It just helps if the cake is that shape to start off with. So I'm just going to get rid of the sharper corners before I go on with more buttercream and create the final shape before the second layer of buttercream. So it does look a little bit messy, but now I'm going to go on with a little bit more buttercream and basically create a second crumb coating and add to the shape of the pumpkin. So I'll just use some plain buttercream here and fill in all the places where I can see cake exposed, like I would do on a normal crumb coat. It's just a different shape. And with your palette knife, you can start to reshape the pumpkin if it did lose its shape slightly when you were carving it. And then, just like before, I've got my piece of acetate, and now I can really work on this curved shape of each segment by bringing the buttercream upwards and curving the edges. So obviously, it's a little longer process than a normal cake would be, but that's the price you have to pay if you want a shaped cake. So once again, this crumb coating doesn't have to be perfect, but this is the foundation of the cake for the next layer. So you want the shape there. So if you want to pack some sides out with buttercream, do it now rather than leave it to the next stage. So one last carving before the final coating of buttercream is this little dip on the very top. So I'm just going to get my smaller knife and kind of go in on a diagonal and create this kind of groove on the top of the pumpkin. And I'm just going to continue and cut into the very top of those grooves I created before. So the pumpkin kind of does this into the center. And now we'll just apply a little bit more plain buttercream to crumb coat the top of the cake. And this time I'm just using a smaller piece of acetate just to smooth out those smaller details at the top. I kind of cut my acetate pieces in all different sizes, depending on the shape I'm creating. Freezer one last time, and I'm going to prepare for the second coating of buttercream. Now before I colour the second coating of buttercream, I want to make sure all the crumbs and spare cake are away. So I want to do the stalk now while my hands are a bit messy and while the crumbs are still out. So I'm going to take some of this leftover cake that I cut out with the buttercream still on it. So it doesn't look so nice at this bit, but basically I'm making a cake pop. So I'm basically going to kind of crumb the cake in my hands, but also mix it with the buttercream. And then if you've got the right amount of cake compared to the right amount of buttercream, you can basically keep massaging it and kind of form a sort of cake dough. So you want it sticky enough so it sticks together, but obviously not too wet with buttercream. And then this is essentially what cake pops are. So cake pops are crushed up cake with buttercream or ganache. And it's a great way to use up extra cake. And then from this, I'm going to create the stalk. So I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller because it's only a small pumpkin. And just push it in my hand to kind of create this stalk shape. And I'm going to put this in the freezer for it to firm up, and then we'll put it on top of the cake when it's ready. So the cake is really cold and I've tidied up all the crumbs, so now I can go over with my orange buttercream. So I coloured the remaining of my white buttercream an orange colour, and I'm basically going to go over the whole cake with a thin layer of this buttercream. So like I would do on any cake, it's just the only difference is obviously the shape. And having the cake cold means that it will actually chill the buttercream slightly and make it easier to shape, especially around the grooves. So now I'm just going to fill in between these grooves with the orange buttercream and try and start smoothing it out. So now I've got a full covering on the cake, I can start working on the shape again, which it looks like I've completely hidden. But what I'm going to do is actually use the palette knife and go down the shapes of those grooves. And that already will start shaping the pumpkin once again. So from the bottom all the way up into the top groove. So now I can see where the grooves are. I can go on with some acetate and create those round shapes now. And once again, I've cut the acetate, so it's roughly the same size as each segment. So it's going to smooth each segment individually. So this bit is really gradual. Once again, it takes a lot of patience. But with the buttercream, we want to mold the buttercream. And when it gets too soft, it's difficult to mold. So I'm basically going to shape it about halfway, put it back in the freezer, and then continue shaping it. So I can see the acetate corners are quite sharp and they're actually cutting into the buttercream. So I'm going to round the corners of the acetate, and hopefully this will give a smoother finish in between the grooves. Yeah, that's a lot better. So that's starting to take shape and looking really good. I'm now going to put this back in the freezer, get it nice and cold, and continue working on the shape. So it's only been in the fridge for about 5 minutes, which firms up the buttercream just a little bit. Instead of putting more buttercream on straight away, I'm going to actually go on with the acetate. and try and move the buttercream that's already on there. And what happens with this buttercream once it's been in the freezer is that when you start touching it after the freezer, it does start to shade a little bit, which I love, especially when it comes to the pumpkin, because obviously it's not one solid color of orange, there's a lot of shades in there. So this technique not only helps shape the pumpkin more, but it brings out the other colors of orange too. So I'm still going to use the palette knife to spread on extra bits of buttercream if needed. And also I really don't mind if the surface isn't 100% smooth either, which is strange for me because I'm usually a bit of a perfectionist. But once again, it just adds to this natural look of the pumpkin. So I'll do a final scrape with the acetate and keep going over the shape until you're happy with it. So I am super happy with the way it's turned out. It looks amazing, even better than last year's one. So it just shows that practice makes the cakes a little bit better. You can see the different shading in the orange and it's become really smooth, but again, not perfect. There's a few ridges, but I'm totally happy with that. I've now taken out the little cake pop stalk from the freezer, which is nice and firm, and going to top it on the cake. So all I need is a little bit of buttercream just to secure it, and then on it goes. So there we go, my pumpkin cake, flavoured with pumpkin spice, and shaped to look like one as well. Give it a go. If you do try it out, please tag me at George's Cakes. I'm really looking forward to seeing your creations or your take on a pumpkin or any Halloween cake for that matter. In the meantime, if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment below with other tutorials that you want to see, and lots more on the way. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon.